This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are delighted to have three really fascinating panelists to talk about the topic of anti-Semitism. With us today are Susan Seeley, who is the former director of UCI's Olive Tree Initiative, and she has been very active in the Jewish community in Orange County. Ed Hayman, who is a colleague of Joel's and mine in the research area, currently a volunteer and consultant in Jewish community matters, especially with the Jewish Federation and Family Services, and Rabbi Edward Eliezrie, who is the spiritual leader of the Chabad of North County, longtime member of the Orange County community, came here in 1988 to start Chabad operations. He's the president of the Rabbinical Council of Orange County and Long Beach, on the board of Jewish Federation and Family Services of Orange County, on the board of governors of the Jewish Agency. Welcome to everyone.
Thank you.
So if I could start it off, first of all, obviously anti-Semitism was a major feature of feudalism, so we have a good connection historically. And I think as we see today, that anti-Semitism had various different permutations, from opportunistic aristocrats to bishops to eventually the Protestants, and of course the good old grassroots anti-Semitism, which seems to never quite go away. But I'd like to just start asking Rabbi Eliezrie, who just came back from Israel, what's the perception in Israel about anti-Semitism in America? America was always seen as the great exception in the history of the diaspora.
I still think it is the great exception, but there's a perception, and I still feel it's the great exception. I think America is a unique, remarkable country. We do have anti-Semites. I think they're somewhat marginalized. We don't find it institutionally in the United States, but there is a sense in Israel like, oh, what's happening to you guys? And why was this so strange? Here I go to Israel. I arrived there a day or so after a war ends, and they're worried about safety of people in Los Angeles. It was a pretty kind of strange dichotomy to find from Israelis. I'm down in the south in the city of Sderot, where they're being shelled every Monday and Tuesday by Hamas. And if you heard, maybe there were 4,000 rockets that went off in about a week and a half, 2 weeks. Well, they get it almost every couple of days. And how are you guys doing in California? They're worried, there's a sushi bar in Los Angeles where there was an attack and they would think all of us are under siege. It's somewhat a lack of a sophisticated view of America, but there is this sense over there that something's happening in America.
Susan, does that make sense to you, or is that what you're hearing? I'm sure you're in touch with people in Israel.
Yes, I am. Yes, also, it's a similar kind of understanding. From my experience, and I know this is probably an experience we all have, Israelis have already a much more nuanced understanding of all of these issues because they're living it day by day. They're living the violence. They're living the political madness, can I say, for over the 4 elections over the past 2 years. And they have a perspective that is often not communicated or misunderstood by those of us in the diaspora. And, there's a lot of conflation of events and just understandings because we all want to, move toward simplification. And we've seen that more and more, of course, in our political discourse and all. It's this kind of wanting to have a binary and simplistic understanding of what's going on. And I think that applies to the issues around anti-Semitism and Israel and Zionism and all of these issues that are so nuanced and complex, but people need to, try to make them understandable and simplistic, and also to, hang their own identities on them. So yes, I agree with what Rabbi Eliezrie said.
Ed, I've got a question for you as a former national security software engineer and somebody who's involved in tracking a lot of fringe activity. What is your sense? We read a lot about the reemergence of anti-Semitism. We see a lot of right-wing and left-wing activity going on. Is it getting worse in the United States for Jews or not? You are muted.
You're muted, Ed.
I think absolutely it's getting worse. Sorry about that, rookie mistake. I think absolutely. And while, I don't know that we have yet sufficient hard numbers to address exactly how bad it is. I think that it has increased. The anecdotal evidence is overwhelming. The media attention on the problem is thick, and I think that it's an outpouring that goes along with trends that are happening not only in the United States but around the world. I think that there has been the political situation as it currently exists and has existed over the last decade or so, with the move towards increased polarization between left and right, the unfettered language that is coming out of both the left extreme and right extreme, which is giving cover to people to reemerge from the woodwork in which they've burrowed over the last 30 or 40 years. To come back out in the light of day and express themselves and express their hatreds has all led to what's happening. And then just the social disintegration that goes along with COVID lockdowns and the fears and the natural tendency on the part of human beings to go tribal in times of crisis. The ancient hatred, I think, has reemerged strongly. And it's evident in social media. It's evident on the streets. People are taking action into their own hands. They're marching. They're protesting, and it's not any particular faction of left or right. It's across the spectrum.
So, as Jews, are we pulling together as a community? If you look at the history of the Jewish people, when we've faced anti-Semitic problems, we've banded together. Do we see the same sense of cohesion and will to fight anti-Semitism? What do you guys think?
I think there is a certain sense of will, but I must disagree with Ed about his analysis, because I think there's a profound difference right now between the anti-Semitism of the right, which is regulated usually to people who are a bit crazy, than the anti-Semitism on the left, where we had a school board member in Virginia last day or two talk about jihad from a podium during a school board graduation, and the school board said that's all about freedom of speech, which really it's blatant anti-Semitism. So I think that we have a problem in this country, and we have a problem coming to grips with what this is, because it's easy to say this word right and left, and I think there is anti-Semitism on the right, but it's basically politically impotent. It's radicalized individuals who do terrible things, which has happened in Poway or what happened in the synagogue in Pittsburgh. What we're seeing on the other end of the spectrum is 4 members of Congress who are openly anti-Semitic and a Democratic Party who doesn't want to condemn them, I think that's politically impotence, and that lacks a certain kind of courage. I'm not, and I think there is on the right, but I think what we're seeing is a manifestation on the left of political power, which is beginning to use for Jews. And for Jews who historically have supported the more left end of the political spectrum, they are having difficulty coming to terms with this, their own group of campers turning on them, and they don't exactly know to hand it. And a lot of that comes from a sense of Jewish insecurity, because we have a problem. When Jews act like Jews, people respect proud Jews. And there's many Jews in this country who have this sense of inner doubt. Maybe it's really my fault. Maybe we wouldn't be like this. If Gaza wasn't being bombed because of shooting missiles at Jews in Israel, everybody wouldn't hate us anymore. When really, this is just today a new manifestation. It used to be we hated the Jews because they went after the Jewish, they did this, they did this. Now the new manifestation of anti-Semitism is a manifestation against Jews' that sense of nationalism. Nobody challenges the right for people in Peru to have a country, but people want to challenge the right for Jews to return to their historical homeland. That's anti-Semitism. And Jews who are not so well educated about Judaism, and Jews who lack that sense of self-security, are afraid to be too strong in standing up to it.
Susan, I assume you have a different take.
It's not necessarily a different take, but to Marshall's question, I do think there is a coming together around this, and I think maybe differently than the left and the right, as Rabbi was articulating. The people more in the center are really dismayed and coming together around understanding this and communicating about it and pulling together about it. I mean, those are the forums and the discussions that I've been a part of. And I heard Deborah Lipstadt talk about this just recently. And she, to your point, Rabbi, about the people on the left and the difficulties with people who are engaged in social activism and then kind of now turning to their neighbors in these social activism groups and having difficulties explaining their own identification with Israel and all. She points out that, it's hard to be in this space of social justice and social activism, and it's hard for the people themselves to be in it. They won't admit themselves to their own bigotry. How can I be a bigot? I'm part of the social justice group. So they're the non-Jews who are in these groups are not owning their own bigotry. And so it's making this conversation really hard, because you can't call them out in a way that you can the people on the right, who it's just blatant, obvious bigotry and hatred and all. So that's a conversation too in those spaces that's happening more and more, that I think is productive. And another thing that Deborah Lipstadt said that I just loved, because so much of this too is tied up with, kind of these conspiracy notions and all. And she says, you can't fight stupid with information. So that's another difficulty that we're having, because, the level-headed kind of Jews who, want to bring nuance and understanding to this whole issue, we've got all the facts and figures, and it's just falling on deaf ears, because again, getting back to the simplicity and what, Ed was saying about tribalism and all that doesn't support nuance and facts and figures and understanding a different narrative.
I would just like, Ed, you're involved in the actual policy making inside the Federation. What should we be doing? What steps can Jews take to protect themselves? We obviously learned the lesson that acquiescence doesn't work. I think that's sort of a big lesson from 50 or 60 years ago. So, Ed, what can the community do? What should it be doing?
I think we should be listening to our neighbors a little bit more. I think that we should be trying to find out, to a certain extent, why our existence tends to excite passions to the extent that it does. I think that too often we have our, let me rephrase. We have our own counterculture among the Jewish people. It consists of two phrases. One is anti-Semitism, the other is the Holocaust. We're going through a period of time right now where there is a growing community of people who believe that it's time to look at the institutional racism that is existent within the structural framework of the United States of America and in many parts of the world. This isn't something that I necessarily adhere to, but as a political scientist, I'm very interested in watching it develop. I think that it's a little too easy, a little too glib to take someone who's got a criticism of us or our people or our behavior or the way we treat other people or any of the concomitant rainbow of activities that we get ascribed to as a people, and dismiss it by either saying that, oh, well, they're invoking the Holocaust and they have no right to do that, or that's anti-Semitism and there's no grounds for it. The left gets a lot of latitude in the press, and I will admit that, but I think that the right also bears a lot of responsibility for the vitriol and the hatred that exists out there. To Rabbi Eliezrie's point, yes, there is a body of people in Congress who are openly expressing their doubts and their, quite frankly, distaste and hatred for Jews. There are also a concomitant number of people on the right who are doing the exact same thing, and yet we for some reason, give them a pass because, well, quite frankly, because they are simply echoing things that they've been saying, since the 1860s and before, and we just write them off as kooks. We don't look at the systemic rationality behind their statements. We just say, oh, those guys are just blowhards. Well, let's be honest. I think that AOC in many respects is a blowhard. I think that Al Sharpton is a blowhard. I also think that Louis Gohmert and Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Madison Cawthorn are blowhards. And I don't think that we can dismiss one group and say they're kooks and then rail heavy on the other side because they're being anti-Semitic. I think they're all being anti-Semitic. And I think the bottom line is that I think we have to look into ourselves and decide what is it that we're doing as a people to propagate these moods, these attitudes, and is there any way that we can educate? And to Susan's point, yes, there is no magic pill for stupidity, but I have to say that I think that doing good works in the community, opening ourselves up, being a little less insular, building relationships, building networks with other faith-based organizations, opening ourselves up, looking for avenues of mutual support and outreach and cross-communication can go a long way. Chabad is legion at this, and I have utmost respect for the fact that usually in any emergency, virtually anywhere around the world, the first rescue team on the ground is Chabad, followed up very shortly by the Israeli Red Cross. We don't get credit for that. But I think that it's the kind of interaction with the world community we need to have. Israel has and Jews have tremendous capacity and resources to do good in the world. And I think that we need to do more of it. I think that we need to fear less and do more in terms of opening ourselves up and in terms of fighting the good fight rather than constantly reacting to the bad fight. I think that there are grounds for reacting to the bad fight. I think there are grounds for responding to anti-Semitism as it occurs. But by the same token, I think that we need to look at and address our own role in some of the bad things that happen in the world, take ownership of them, and do things to address that rather than just shutting it down and saying, we're Jews, we can't do anything wrong.
So is it, Ed, is it a substantive question of not doing the right things, or is it a marketing problem? Is it a social media marketing problem? We're just not getting it out there.
I think it's both, Marshall. I think that I look back at the heyday of Hasbara in after the 67 war, the interim period between 1967 and 1973, where Jews went from an obscure people and an obscure little piece of territory in the Middle East to being, the strong, self-sufficient, everybody wants to be a friend of heyday. It took some lumps in 73. And then it took big lumps in the 80s with the invasion of Lebanon. I don't dispute what happened in those circumstances, but I do think that you can look at worldviews towards Israel, towards settlements, towards the occupation, or the recovery of, or in the more extreme circles, the colonization of. I think that we need to do a better job of explaining what we do well and owning what we don't do well and seeing if we can't fix it. So I think I don't know what the ratio is, 50-50 or not, but I do believe it's a two-edged problem where we don't sing our own praises sufficiently. We don't get people to recognize the good work that we're doing around the world. But by the same token, we tend to get very defensive when anyone criticizes us, either as a people or as a nation.
Rabbi Eliezrie,
I have a core philosophical disagreement with that. First, I just want to make one point. There is a very big difference between Al Sharpton, who instigated the only pogrom in American history, walked the streets of Brooklyn and has put a whole Jewish community in terror. And he was the owner of a pogrom, documented in a report by the governor of the state of New York, who somehow gets politically rehabilitated, and during the Obama administration is welcomed over 100 times in the White House. And it's just shocking that that man should have any political standing in this country, or an AOC or these other people who have political power than those which I mentioned before, except very few on the other end of the spectrum who don't have political power. And that's what my difference is. I'm not saying Al Sharpton is an immoral, evil human being, but he has power. And people run to him for approval to become a political elected official, the man who instigated a pogrom against Jews in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights. So I think there's a vast difference between those with political power, who for some reason it's okay to be anti-Semitic, and the few weirdos on the other end of the spectrum who don't have that political power, even though there are probably few that do, but they're very marginal. Number two, the issue of anti-Semitism goes to a much deeper core. It's not just what we do, it's who we are. Because the very core is Jews came to Mount Sinai and were given the message to the world of justice, decency, monotheism. And guess what? Not everybody wants to hear that message. And you have to ask yourself a question. If the Christians hated us and the Muslims hated us, different historical periods, and then we suffered through the secularists, which was communism and fascism of Germany, which were totally anti-religious movements that tried to hate us, that hated us. And then afterwards, we're dealing with different issues here in America. Now we have the hatred of Israel. Every spectrum, every end of the political spectrum at one period in history didn't like us too much. What's the point? We are the canary in the coal mine, because we come to the world with a message and saying, listen, there's an idea of belief in one God. There's an idea of justice. There's an idea of dignity. And those ideas challenge other human beings, and it makes them uncomfortable, because it makes them uncomfortable to the degree of anti-Semitism. And finally, we can do a lot of nice things. And yeah, you're right. When there was an earthquake in Haiti, or a tsunami in Japan, the first group of campers on the ground were Chabad rabbis, and then afterwards other people followed. The hilarious thing I have to tell you is when the Israeli army arrived in Haiti, they didn't have any food with them. We had to buy thousands of kosher MREs because they came, but they weren't equipped. Now they've learned a little better. So when they came to Nepal, they had no place to stay. We hired hotel rooms so they could take showers. But it's not about being, oh, I'm so wonderful because I did this. Face the fact. There's anti-Semitism because we have a message. And that message is of monotheism, of justice, of dignity. And some people resent that message. And one final point. Part of the whole, we can't solve this whole problem because there's always going to be somebody who doesn't like us. But when we go and say, oh, it's because Jews are not perfect and Israel is not perfect. But at the same time, we have to realize that there is a deeper reason for this anti-Semitism. And when we're proud Jews and we act with dignity to other people, which includes also doing what Ed said, doing acts of kindness and compassion for other human beings, people are going to respect us for who we are. But we found throughout history, when the Jews of Germany wanted to assimilate all the way, guess what happened? What was the result? When the Jews in Russia wanted to become the best communists, what happened? And the Jews in America who want to hide their Jewishness because please like me a little bit, I want to join the country club. Now we can join the country club. It's the opposite. What I find is the only guy who looks like this on the panel. And if anybody's going to attract anti-Semitism of all, it's going to be me. I have almost never had an anti-Semitic thing in my life, except very rarely, and I stood up to it. And that shocked them. One day somebody came to beat up my kids, and because they were Jews, so I went out with a baseball bat and I told the kids, I'm going to beat you up. So the cops came to my house. He said, what are you doing? I said, listen, nobody beats up a Jew because they're a Jew. He said, you can't do that. I said, you better take care of them because I will myself. In other words, to be unafraid to stand up for who we are and with a sense of dignity. Thank God I never had to raise a hand against another human being in my life. But the point is, we have to act with a sense of pride, and we have to act with the pride in our values. And then people are going to respect us. And what I have discovered in America, and I believe that America is what is called the Medina Shel Chesed, a country of compassion, a country of goodness. The very core values of the society are remarkable. We conquered Japan. We turned it into an independent, thriving democracy that does business and competes with us. The same thing we did in Europe. We don't take other people's countries. We're a different kind of society. This is not inherently a bad country. And I think there's also a degree of alarmism in the Jewish community about anti-Semitism, making it a little bit sometimes more than it is, because instead of focusing on Jewish learning, instead of focusing on Jewish observance, focusing on Jewish spirituality, we got to be Jewish. So now we have something to get excited about, and the ADL and other groups can raise money because there's 3 more anti-Semitic attacks. There's a problem out there. It's real, but we also have to put it into focus. I feel very secure as a Jew in America.
How does the play out of anti-Semitism in the United States, in American society, interlock or intertwine with people's views toward Israel's behavior on the world stage? How is this? How do they reinforce each other? Do they not reinforce each other?
They reinforce each other. And I'll give you the classic example, because I've been doing battle with the LA Times over the last week and a half. They've had 3 stories by a reporter in Lebanon about the destruction in Gaza. Now, the destruction in Gaza is real. I have sent to the LA Times, and one editor responded to me, point by point criticisms of these articles, not malicious criticism. Why don't you give context? Why don't you explain that what Hamas's intention is? Why don't you tell them that Hamas causes the war? They don't want to print it. They don't want to print it. Why don't they want to print it? Because they're in this kind of woke kind of world over there, that reporter. And I got to show now what has happened to the people of Gaza is an absolute tragedy. The fact is that I heard a briefing from a senior military commander on the Gaza border 2 weeks ago. And he told me one of the great tragedies, young people can't leave the country. They can't go anywhere. And yes, last week, a couple of days ago on Israeli TV, there was a whole piece about the children of the leaders of Hamas, how these people are worth hundreds of millions of dollars that they stole from the poor people of Gaza. And what's the point? You attack Israel, they respond. And to stop the attacks because they're tired of sitting in bomb shelters, then it looks bad to the world. So you must be bad people. And the Los Angeles Times does not have the moral courage to act like true journalists and to write the real story. Because I don't know, maybe they're anti-Semitic. I don't know if they're I'm not going to go read in their feelings about what it is. So we have a story, and sometimes it's not sweet. But right now, there's one difference. The difference is for years, for thousands of years, Jews could not stand up for themselves. And one of the things I saw in Israel 2 weeks ago is I showed up very privately the F-35, the new most advanced fighter jet in the world that almost nobody gets to see. Why I got it is a whole different story. Guess what? Today, Jews have F-35s. We ain't going to be knocked around anymore. And that bothers people because they want the quiet, vulnerable Jew. Oh, you're cute. You're nice. You eat kugel. You talk about God a little bit. Now you got the Jew who's proud, is going to stand up. Gets a lot of people a little bit nervous.
Susan, I just want to ask you, you're the one who's interfacing with some of the people that the rabbis talking about at LA Times, basically people who at least maybe approach these issues with some hostility, particularly towards Israel. How do how do you or how do we address those people and maybe begin to change their perceptions, or is it a hopeless case?
I don't think it's a hopeless case, because I know it's not a hopeless case. I've seen understandings and perspectives change on the ground when I've taken people to Israel to expose them to the complexities and the various narratives in the region. In fact, I would just getting back to something that Ed had said about kind of having allies in this and education around this. One of the most virulent fighters of anti-Semitism I know is a friend of mine who is a Pakistani Muslim. She's an American citizen, Pakistani Muslim, who fights anti-Semitism in the Muslim community more boldly than many of the Jewish people I know. So, having allies like that is really important, combating misinformation in the communities that we don't necessarily have a voice, that we're listened to. But getting to your point about knowing some of these people, when we're talking about things like Gaza, I communicated with a colleague of mine who lives in Gaza, who is not affiliated with Hamas, and who's a humanitarian worker. And that's part of the education on all sides, is to remember to separate these national actors and the military actors from the people who are enduring this, both in Israel and Gaza, because those people are the victims, and to kind of remember to focus on those people, and that they are the victims of all the misinformation in a way that we are not, when we kind of go along with hyperbole and extremist language on either side in our own communities as well. We're not helping the people who are the victims of the actual violence. And also, I agree with something Rabbi said about the Jews kind of being the canary in the coal mine. And again, to me, that gets back to our allyship, because there are people in myriad communities who recognize that Jews are the canary in the coal mine. And it's the poem, I always forget the person's name, the person they came for the
Bonhoeffer.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And Yad Vashem, and there are communities who recognize that, and they recognize the Jews as having that, and, I had friends in the LGBTQ community who recognize that and are concerned about what's going on in terms of anti-Semitism and this conflating of international and then regional kind of affairs. And then I also kind of agree with what the Rabbi said about this tendency towards alarmist language and alarmist calling out of my friend Peter Levy, who's the director of the ADL here in Orange County and Long Beach, he reports that over the period of the Israel-Gaza conflict, anti-Semitic incidents were doubled nationally. And yet it's same thing with what was going on during the violence, and people would talk to me about what was going on. And I have a friend who lives in Jaffa, where we know that some of that violence occurred, but his young children go to a school for Arabs and Jews. And I checked in with him. They got up and took their kids to school every day during that episode. So those are the things that we don't know that are happening, that aren't getting reported. And those are the kinds of things that the kind of education that we engaged in at OTI, this experiential education, this immersive education, it's so valuable. And there are myriad programs that do this kind of thing, where it's a person to person, and you're hearing from the people themselves and how they're affected and how language hurts and how, their self-identity is being miscommunicated and I've just forgotten the word, appropriated by, the opposing community in ways that are painful and all. So it's not a hopeless cause. And yes, transformation is absolutely possible. It's absolutely possible. I saw it all the time with the students and the community members that I worked with, who went into the region understanding one thing, having one completely solid identification and conviction about what they thought politically, and coming away with a completely new understanding of the situation for themselves, and to share. And they went on and shared that with others as well. So yeah, Ed, yes, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to back up what Susan was saying, not only about OTI, but about the need for the check-in and the communication and the recognition of all people as people. And to go back a little bit on some of Rabbi Eliezrie's points, particularly with respect to why is it that the ADL is reaching out to people like Al Sharpton? Why is it that we're trying to seek dialogue with people who don't like us very much?
Excuse me, Ed, there's a very...
may have in fact, perpetrated horrible things against us in the past. The reality is that, as Brian Stevenson says, nobody wants to be remembered permanently for the worst thing that they ever did in life, especially if there are other things they do. And I think that I think that I'm going to say it once more, we have our own cancel culture among Jews, where we try and vilify people on the basis of past acts, and not look to see, why is it that Al Sharpton has such power? Why is it that his message resonates among the people that he rabble-rouses when he does get on that rabble-rousing kick? I think that after his illness, Al Sharpton changed dramatically, not only physically, but mentally. I think that he is dedicated himself to a certain extent at building bridges, which he had spent a lot of time tearing down in the past. And quite frankly, if we're going to have any voice in the African-American community in New York and in the centers that he has power in, he's the person we have to convince. And if we just write him off as an anti-Semite or a blowhard or a pogrom instigator, and don't look to ways that we can work together, find areas of common agreement, allow him to a certain extent to rehabilitate himself, educate him, bring him around, then we write off that entire community and we go on for another generation being the hated little people that we are. So from that standpoint, I think that I hearken back to an article I read a long time ago by Paul Warnke that was in Foreign Affairs, that it had to do with the SALT talks between the US and the Soviet Union. And what he said is that, look, we've been fighting the same battle with these people for decades, and it's not getting us anywhere. Nothing has changed. And as Rabbi said, yes, in every generation, in every millennium, in every century, Jews seem to be hated. It's because, and I think to a certain extent it is because we have a message. I think to a certain extent it's because there are preternatural angers that different people have towards other people. I think humans are tribal animals. But by the same token, if the patterns of activity haven't changed and our behaviors haven't changed at the same time, maybe it's a time to look at the way we communicate and the way we behave in order to try and see if we can't get off the treadmill and start engaging with one another. And to lob missiles and to, anytime a missile comes from Gaza, my feeling is, okay, well, the artillery comes around in about 15, 20 minutes. The bottom line is that we keep throwing the same rocks at each other year after year, decade after decade, century after century, and then wonder why we can't get along. We can't get along because we dismiss one another's viewpoints. We can't get along because we write each other off for the things that we did before, the things we need to do. We don't look to Al Sharpton to explain to us why it is that they're so angry at us, because we don't respect what he has to say and we discount it. I think that the only way we're ever going to progress out of the hole that we're in as a society is if we start to simply communicate, listen to one another, and recognize that people don't just hate for the sake of hating. They usually have a reason. And if they don't have a reason, then maybe you can educate them out of their viewpoints. And I think that that's where the idea of good works come in, is a way of showing people that the biases that they have, regardless of where they may have come from, whether it's racism, institutional or not, whether it's hatred that they learned at home, whether it's a hatred they learned in their community, if it's a hatred they learned in their church, it's based on irrational fear. And the only way to overcome that is to let people see us for who we are, as the good people we are, as the believing people that we are, and try and work with them constructively rather than writing them off in a knee-jerk fashion and shutting them down. On the right, there's this big concern about the left and cancel culture. We need to recognize the cancel cultures that we exercise ourselves and try and get past the stereotypes we hold of other people and their motivations and their rationalities for doing the things that we do.
I like to say one thing. There is a profound difference between Al Sharpton and anybody else. And I want to tell you the reason why, because I know a lot more about Al Sharpton. Al Sharpton instigated a pogrom against the Jewish people. Al Sharpton denied he did it. Al Sharpton was spoken to privately by Jewish leaders and said, you want to make peace, come back to Crown Heights and apologize for what you did. Those Jewish leaders, primarily from the Reform movement and the ADL, tried to engage him, and they realized that he has not changed. He's the same piece of trash now that he was then, and they have severed their relationship with them after after having it, because they did what we warned them strongly about who he was, and they recognize up close that he's the same immoral, illegal, immoral anti-Semite now that he was before, and he's a pathological liar. And for us as a community that suffered a pogrom because of this man, for another Jewish organization to give him a pass when he won't come back and say, I made a mistake and I'm wrong, for those hundreds of children that sat in homes and lived in a pogrom, is immoral for those Jewish organizations. And I mean it, what I say it. Nobody has a right to give him a pass. We're the ones who lived in terror. He and those people, I can tell you, the leaders of the Reform movement have told me privately that they made a terrible mistake inviting him to their conference. And Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, has cut off all relationships with him because he knows what we have warned about him. He's been approached privately. He doesn't want to change. He is who he is. He's a liar and a thief. He stole from taxes on every level. And how American can give him a pass? And I don't, by the way, I'm part of the group that reaches out to everybody in the society, from the right to the left, from all that. But a person who brings violence and says, I never did it and won't apologize, is not somebody that we can do business with. However, other segments of the society, I do agree with you. And I agree with them, particularly within the Jewish community, that we have to try to reach between the different ends of the community and have a connection, one person to another, ones we don't agree with it profoundly. And there was a member of the Israeli Supreme Court called Chaim Cohen, who was the most anti-religious member of the Israeli Supreme Court. There was an article published about this a few days ago. He was the most anti-religious member. In 1975, he came to the Simchat Torah celebration at the Lubavitch Rebbe, and he got the greatest honor. The whole Jewish world was shell-shocked. Here was the most anti-religious guy in the Israeli Supreme Court, made all kinds of laws against religious people, and he got the greatest sense of honor, because we have to treat people we don't agree with dignity and respect. But you can't take a man who instigates violence and organizes a pogrom and says, I never did it and I won't apologize, and give him honor. So Al Sharpton is out of the game. And any Jewish organization, I want to say up front, that will try to engage with him, we will protest it publicly, privately, as being an immoral act. I also agree with this idea of building allies and working with other groups, but he, in my mind, is what we call treif. He is an evil man. And so I'm sorry for being so strong about this, but I know
the point is, I can see both sides of this. I can see that I can see there are people who are, beyond the pale and beyond beyond consideration for working. But I think everybody on this call pretty much agrees that the only real solution is outreach, continued outreach. We want to, as a scientist myself, I'm a big believer in genetic memory. I believe that if you go generation after generation after generation and instill a particular set of values or a particular set of thinking, somehow that gets ingrained in people's underlying values. And if Ed, I think, makes a very valid point, which is you've got to look at how to break that cycle at some point. So
and break it, Marshall, with a person who has no regret, no remorse. And he is that person. Other people, I agree with you, but not him.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I want to thank everybody for what
Sorry
has
for
been
getting
a
so
very.
excited about that subject, but it's really personally sensitive to me.
No, I understand it, and we respect that. We respect that. This has been just a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, for your wonderful views, and God willing, we'll have this conversation a year from now, and hopefully things will have improved in the climate on anti-Semitism. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
also,
you.
Sam.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure.